My name's Thomas Reynolds, and I'm 57 years old. I've spent over 3 decades building companies from the ground up, guiding bright-eyed founders, mentoring ambitious dreamers, turning coffee-fueled ideas into multi-million-dollar realities. I've sat in boardrooms that smelled of new leather and ambition, where every handshake meant either success or survival. I've seen the business world change, evolve, twist itself into something unrecognizable. But through it all, I stayed steady, consistent, reliable at least. That's what I thought loyalty meant. But the funny thing about loyalty? It only matters until someone thinks you're replaceable. For years I believed that dedication was enough. That showing up early, staying late, and keeping your word still meant something in this new world of hashtags and hotshots. I believed that experience was respected, that it mattered. Turns out, it doesn't, not anymore. Because one morning, in the same glass-walled office I helped design, I learned that loyalty has an expiration date, and mine had just run out. His name was Evan Parker, my boss, my protege, and once upon a time, like a son to me. I'd known him since he was 24, full of spark and swagger, talking faster than he could think, always dreaming bigger than his wallet could handle. I saw myself in him, the younger version of me, all confidence and chaos, so I taught him. I shared my playbook, my life's playbook. I showed him how to handle investors, how to read a room, how to win trust before even speaking. I backed him when nobody else believed in him. I fought for him, protected him, and in return he gave me loyalty, at least for a while. That morning started like any other. I remember it clearly. The smell of burnt coffee, the faint hum of the city outside, the buzz of the office floor. People smiled at me, the kind of polite smiles people give to the old guard, the respected veteran who's no longer dangerous but still worth nodding. I walked into Evan's office with a folder of reports, numbers that could have made our company's next quarter the strongest in years. I was proud of the work, proud of the growth, but when I opened the door, something felt off. Evan wasn't smiling. His tone was clipped. He said, "Thomas, can we make this quick?" That's when I knew something was wrong. He leaned back in his chair, young, sleek, confident. The kind of confidence only people with no scars can have. He looked at me the way a landlord looks at old furniture, useful once, but now just taking up space. Then he said the words I'll never forget. "You're too old to keep up with modern strategies, Thomas. We need fresh energy, young ideas." For a few seconds, I couldn't even breathe. I just stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, to tell me it was some kind of twisted joke. But his expression never changed. He meant it. You know what's strange? When betrayal happens, it's not loud. It's quiet, eerily quiet. I could hear the ticking of the clock on his wall, the faint hum of the air conditioner, the sound of my own heartbeat getting heavier by the second. 30 years of dedication. Reduced to a sentence, all the nights I stayed late to help him meet deadlines, all the times I defended his decisions to skeptical investors, all the weekends I missed with my family because he needed help preparing for a pitch, and now I was just too old. He said it so casually, as if I were a piece of outdated software that needed uninstalling. I tried to speak, to remind him of everything we'd built together, but the words stuck in my throat. I could only manage a shaky, "You really think I can't keep up?" He shrugged. "It's not personal, Thomas. It's just business. The market's changing. We need people who can adapt faster." Then he smiled, that slick, self-assured smile that used to inspire me, and added, "You've had a great run, but it's time for new blood." New blood. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and to twist the knife even deeper, he told me they were replacing me with some 29-year-old tech guru, a kid who spent more time making TikTok reels about leadership than actually leading. I'd seen this guy once. He wore sneakers to board meetings, called everyone bro, and couldn't make eye contact for longer than 2 seconds. This was my replacement. I didn't argue, I didn't shout, I just nodded, turned around and walked out. But every step I took toward that elevator felt like another nail in the coffin of everything I'd worked for. When the elevator doors closed, I caught my reflection in the mirror, tired eyes, gray streaks in my hair, lines on my face that hadn't been there before. For the first time in my life, I saw what the world probably saw, an old man, but inside, I wasn't done, not even close. I went home that evening in silence. My wife, Linda, knew something was wrong the moment I walked through the door. She didn't say much, just placed her hand on mine and whispered, "Whatever it is, we'll get through it." But I couldn't stop replaying those words in my head. "You're too old to keep up." They echoed in every corner of my mind, growing louder with each hour that passed, and that's when something inside me hardened. I realized, if this world thought age was a weakness, I'd turn it into my weapon. If they thought I was done, I'd show them what experience could really do. Because what Evan didn't know was that this old man still had one more move left, and it would change everything. I still remember the very first day I met Evan Parker. It was nearly 15 years ago, a warm spring morning in downtown Chicago. I was consulting for a logistics firm back then, wrapping up a contract that had drained me mentally but paid the bills. My career was at that stage where people called me a veteran, which is just a polite way of saying you're not new, but not exciting anymore. I was sipping lukewarm coffee in a noisy cafe when this nervous-looking kid in a wrinkled shirt and untied tie came up to me. He said, "Mr. Reynolds, you don't know me, but I really need 5 minutes of your time." I almost told him I was busy, but there was something in his eyes, a fire, the same kind of spark I once had when I was his age, so I nodded and said, "All right, kid, 5 minutes." That 5 minutes turned into 2 hours. He told me about his idea, a company that could digitize and automate the broken logistics industry, connecting small businesses to large supply chains through data analytics. At the time, the idea sounded ambitious, and maybe too ambitious, but there was something raw and honest about his passion. He didn't just want to make money. He wanted to build something that mattered. Remember his words clearly, "Mr. Reynolds, you've built empires before. Help me build mine." And for some reason, those words hit me deeper than he probably intended. I had already achieved enough in my career. Money wasn't the goal anymore. Legacy was. So I agreed. We shook hands right there in that noisy cafe, surrounded by the chatter of strangers. And that's where Venture Link Solutions was born. Just two people, one big dream, and a whiteboard full of possibilities. The early days were chaotic. We worked out of a cramped co-working space that smelled like burnt espresso and desperation. The walls were thin, the chairs wobbled, and the Wi-Fi barely worked half the time. But I loved it. Evan would come in every morning before sunrise with a notebook full of scribbles and wild ideas. I'd ground him, help him filter the noise from the strategy. We were a good team, his energy and my experience. He was the dreamer. I was the anchor. I taught him how to talk to investors, how to listen instead of just pitch, how to negotiate deals that didn't just sound good but actually made sense. I still remember our first investor meeting. Evan was so nervous his hand trembled while pouring water. I leaned over and whispered, "Calm down, kid. They're just people with checkbooks and not gods." He laughed nervously and said, "You make it sound easy." And I smiled back. It's only easy once you've been burned enough times. Months passed, then years. And slowly, VentureLink started to take shape. We landed small clients first, mom and pop stores that needed digital supply chain help. Then medium-sized companies. Then one day we got a call from a major national retailer. That deal changed everything. Suddenly, we weren't the underdogs anymore. We were contenders. Our phones wouldn't stop ringing. Investors wanted in. Analysts called us the rising star of American logistics. And through it all, Evan and I stood shoulder to shoulder, celebrating every victory like two soldiers after a long battle. He'd often pat me on the back and say, "Couldn't have done it without you, Thomas." And I believed him. I didn't care that my name wasn't on the building. I didn't need fame or a flashy title. My satisfaction came from seeing what we'd built, the systems I designed, the strategies I implemented, the people I'd trained. It was mine. Even if the world didn't know it, and Evan, well, he was like a son to me. I'd never had kids of my own, and mentoring him gave me a sense of purpose that went beyond business. He'd call me late at night to ask for advice. He'd show up at my house for Thanksgiving when his own family couldn't make it. Linda would cook him dinner, and we'd all sit around the table laughing about the early struggles, the sleepless nights, the near disasters. He wasn't just my boss or my partner, but he was family. But success. Success is a strange thing. It doesn't just build. It changes. As the company grew, so did Evan's confidence and his circle. Suddenly, he was surrounded by people half his age with fancy degrees and buzzwords for brains. He started hiring consultants who charged more for advice than we paid our entire staff. They came in wearing expensive watches, talking about next-gen ecosystems, AI-driven efficiency, and digital disruption. I'd sit in meetings listening to them spew nonsense, using words that meant absolutely nothing. When they'd finish, Evan would nod like they'd just unlocked the secrets of the universe. Then he'd turn to me and say, "What do you think, Thomas?" And I'd answer honestly, "Sounds like smoke and mirrors. We should focus on our fundamentals." He'd smile politely, but I could see it in his eyes. The doubt. The impatience. The unspoken thought. Maybe the old man doesn't get it anymore. The first real crack came during a quarterly strategy meeting. We were discussing a potential merger with a startup that, frankly, had no real value except hype. I explained that it was risky, that the numbers didn't support the decision, but Evan brushed me off. He looked around the room, smirked, and said, "No offense, Thomas, but we need less old-school thinking in the room." The entire room went quiet. Some of the younger staff exchanged awkward glances. Others chuckled under their breath. I forced a smile, pretending it didn't sting. I even said, "Well, if old school keeps the company afloat, maybe it's not that bad." Everyone laughed, except Evan. And that's when I felt it. A tiny shift, the kind that seems harmless at first, but deep down, you know it's the beginning of something breaking. After that day, things started changing. Subtly, quietly. Evan stopped copying me on major decisions. He began having closed-door meetings with the board. Younger hires started reporting directly to him, bypassing my department entirely. And slowly, I began to feel like a guest in the company I helped build. My ideas were outdated. My experience was valuable but not relevant. It's funny. People say betrayal happens fast. But no, it doesn't. It happens slowly, drip by drip, until one day you realize the well has run dry. I'd walk through the office and feel invisible. The same people who once looked up to me now avoided eye contact. Even Evan started addressing me differently. No more Tom, just Thomas. Colder, distant, professional. Something had shifted, not just in him, but in us. I told myself it was just a phase, that success was getting to his head, that it would pass. But deep down, I knew. The boy I once mentored, the one who looked at me with respect and gratitude, was gone. In his place stood a man intoxicated by power, blinded by his own reflection. And I, Thomas Reynolds, the man who built him, who protected him, who believed in him, was slowly becoming obsolete. It was a Monday morning, one of those gray, lifeless Mondays where even the sky looks tired. The kind where you drink your coffee a little slower, hoping the caffeine might somehow make the day go smoother. I remember everything. The taste of that black coffee, slightly burnt but familiar. The weight of my briefcase, the shuffle of people passing by in the lobby of VentureLink headquarters. The elevator ride up to the 12th floor felt like every other morning. Same music, same hum, same routine. I had no idea that by the time I rode that elevator back down, I'd no longer belong there. That day I was on top of my game. I had just closed a massive partnership deal, one that would bring in several $1 million in new business. It had taken months of negotiation, 1,000 late-night calls, and a level of persistence that only comes from experience. I remember thinking, this one's going to make Evan proud. I even imagined him shaking my hand, like old times, saying, "You've still got it, Thomas." I walked into the office with that quiet satisfaction you get when you know you've earned your keep. My colleagues greeted me with polite smiles, though lately they'd started feeling more like strangers. You can always sense when something's changed, when people look at you not as a mentor, but as a memory they're waiting to move past. Still, I brushed it off. I was focused, positive, ready to share the good news. When I reached Evan's office, the blinds were half drawn. The room was dim, cold, not the usual upbeat, start-of-the-week energy he used to have. He was sitting behind his sleek desk, tapping away on his laptop. not even glancing up when I entered. I knocked lightly on the glass door. "Morning, Evan. Got a few minutes?" Without looking up, he said, "Yeah, come in. Let's keep this short." Something about his tone froze me mid-step. It wasn't his usual impatient tone. It was distant, almost rehearsed. I sat down across from him, clutching my folder. He finally looked up, but his eyes, those confident, charming eyes I once admired, and were cold. Then he said it, flatly, like reading from a memo. "Thomas, we're restructuring. Your position's being phased out, just like that. No build-up, no explanation, no emotion." For a second, I thought I misheard him. I blinked, forcing a small laugh. "Phased out? What does that mean?" "I'm head of operations, Evan. You need me." He exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair. The same leather chair I once helped him pick out when we first moved into that office. He crossed his arms, speaking with this fake corporate calmness that made my skin crawl. "You've done great work, Thomas. No one's denying that. But the company's moving in a new direction. The board wants younger energy, more innovative minds. We need to modernize." Modernize. There it was, the word people like him used when they wanted to push someone out without sounding like villains. But then he said the words that would haunt me. Younger energy. Those two words hit me harder than anything else could have. They cut deeper than any layoff notice or pay cut. Younger energy. As if experience had suddenly become a liability. As if the gray in my hair was some kind of virus that infected innovation. I stared at him, searching for even a flicker of guilt, something human. But all I saw was detachment. "Cold corporate detachment, so this is it?" I asked quietly. "You're just letting me go?" He nodded, glancing briefly at his watch like he had somewhere better to be. "We'll make sure you get a fair severance package. HR has all the details." HR, the word felt insulting. After 15 years of loyalty, of building his dream, I was being reduced to a file in HR. I tried to stand my ground. "Evan, we just landed the Brigham deal last week, my deal. That partnership alone could double our revenue next quarter. You think your new, younger energy can handle that?" He gave a half smile, the kind people give when they've already made up their mind. "Thomas, this isn't personal. It's about the company's future. You've done great things, but it's time to step aside and let new leadership take over." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see the kid I'd mentored. I saw a stranger in a designer suit, hiding behind empty words. Something in me snapped. "Step aside. I built this company, Evan. I was here before the name VentureLink even existed. You came to me for guidance, remember? I taught you how to close your first deal." His jaw tightened. "Thomas, please don't make this harder than it needs to be." That line, "don't make this harder," was his way of saying, just disappear quietly. I felt anger rising, but also a strange calm, the kind that comes right before the storm. I looked around his office, the photos of him shaking hands with investors, the framed headlines praising his visionary leadership. Every single one of those achievements had my fingerprints on it. Every deal, every campaign, every success story, I all built on the foundation I helped lay. And now, I was being erased. I wish I could say I gave some powerful speech before walking out. I didn't. I just sat there for a few seconds, staring at the young man who once called me his mentor, the same man now treating me like a relic. Then I stood up, straightened my tie, and said quietly, "One day, you'll understand what loyalty means, Evan. I just hope it won't be too late." He didn't respond. He just lowered his eyes back to his laptop and said, "HR will handle the rest." That was it. 15 years, gone in 15 seconds. The next hour passed in a blur. Security showed up, not because I caused a scene, but because protocol required it. They watched me pack my things into a cardboard box, the same kind they used for office supplies. A few people stopped by my desk to whisper awkward goodbyes, their faces full of pity they were too afraid to show openly. Nobody wanted to stand too close to a man being escorted out. It was as if failure was contagious. No farewell gathering. No handshake, just cold silence and the rhythmic click of the security guard's shoes behind me as we walked toward the elevator. I'll never forget that moment when the elevator doors closed. I caught my reflection again, that same tired face from the day I first doubted myself. But this time, I didn't see defeat, I saw fire, a spark, a quiet, burning anger that I hadn't felt in years. I walked out of that building carrying a box of memories, photos, old notebooks, a pen Linda gave me when the company first launched. I set the box in the back seat of my car, sat behind the wheel and just sat there. The world outside kept moving, people rushing, traffic honking, the usual city chaos. But inside that car, time froze. I replayed every moment, every sacrifice, every late night, every lesson I'd given Evan for free. And for what? To be replaced by someone who barely understood what integrity meant. I'll be honest, for a few minutes, I felt broken, utterly crushed. It wasn't about the job, it was about the betrayal. Because betrayal doesn't come from your enemies. It comes from the people you once trusted most. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, and that's when a voice inside me whispered, calm, but sharp. You built that empire, Thomas. You can build another, or better yet, buy his. That thought hit me like lightning. In that single moment, the pain began to shift, slowly hardening into purpose, into strategy, into revenge. I started the car, looked up at the towering glass building one last time, and muttered under my breath, enjoy it while it lasts. Evan, you just fired the wrong man. Then I drove off, not as a defeated old employee, but as a man with a mission. Because what Evan didn't know yet was that the story he thought he'd ended that morning had only just begun. Losing my job wasn't just a setback. It was a slow, suffocating kind of humiliation. The kind that seeps into your bones. For 30 years, my work had been my identity. My routine, my pride. Every morning had a purpose. Meetings, decisions, deadlines. Now every morning felt empty. The first few days after the firing, I told myself I'd bounce back soon. That it was just a bad dream. A phase, a misunderstanding. But days turned into weeks, and the silence in my house grew heavier. I'd sit at the kitchen table, coffee growing cold in my hands, staring at the same four walls, wondering who I was without that company. I'd wake up, get dressed like I was still going to work, shirt, tie, even the same cologne, and then realize I had nowhere to go. It's strange how quickly purpose disappears. One day you're signing million-dollar contracts. The next you're checking your emails just to feel relevant. Linda, my wife, tried to comfort me. She'd smile, bring me breakfast, tell me it was just a temporary storm. But I could see the worry behind her eyes, the silent fear of watching her husband crumble. At night, I'd catch her glancing at the bills piling up on the counter. She never said a word, but the tension between us grew. Our savings started shrinking faster than I expected. No paycheck meant no peace of mind. And for the first time in decades, I felt useless. Not because of money, but because I felt like I'd lost my worth. The world moved on without me. Old contacts stopped replying. Former colleagues avoided calls. Even the company website, and the one I helped design, had erased my name from the founders section. I was a ghost in the very empire I helped build. One gray afternoon, I sat in my study, scrolling through LinkedIn, mindlessly reading posts about innovation and next-gen leadership. And then I saw him, Evan Parker, grinning in a perfectly lit photo, shaking hands with a new investor. The caption below read, "Out with the old, in with the bold. The future belongs to those who innovate." My heart stopped. That one sentence and that smug little slogan had felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Out with the old. That was me. He was mocking me, publicly dressing up betrayal as ambition, turning my exit into his motivational speech. I stared at that post for a long time, every word burning into my mind. And then, something inside me shifted. The fog I'd been drowning in began to lift. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my office, surrounded by boxes of old files, notebooks, and photos, relics of a man everyone had written off. For hours, I replayed every conversation, every lesson, every deal I'd made, all the wisdom I'd gathered over decades, the same wisdom Evan had once begged me to share. And I realized something simple, but powerful. Maybe the world had changed, but I still had something they didn't. Experience. I didn't need to compete with the young. I needed to outsmart them. So I made a decision. If the world thought I was too old to compete, I'd prove them wrong, and I meant it. The very next morning, I started rebuilding. No investors, no office, no team, just me. And a second-hand laptop sitting on my kitchen table. I began learning, truly learning, everything I'd ignored while climbing the old corporate ladder. I took online courses in digital markets, venture capital, and startup analytics. I spent nights watching webinars about cryptocurrency, tech funding, and modern branding. I reconnected with the new generation, the dreamers, the builders, the 20-somethings with fire in their eyes. Instead of dismissing their energy like I once did, I studied it, their language, their mindset, their hunger, and slowly, I started to adapt. It wasn't easy. Imagine a 57-year-old man sitting in online classes with kids half his age, talking about blockchain, NFTs, digital ecosystems, and influencer markets. Half the time, I didn't understand a word they were saying. The other half, I was too proud to ask questions, but every night, I forced myself to keep going because deep down, I knew this was my rebirth. I wasn't just learning new tricks. I was rewriting the very rules I once lived by. Linda noticed the change first. She'd walk into the room at midnight and see me hunched over my laptop, scribbling notes like a college student. "Thomas," she'd whisper, "it's late. Come to bed." But for the first time in months, I felt alive again. My eyes burned, my back ached, but my mind was on fire. I'd tell her softly, "Go ahead, honey. I just need a little more time. I'm on to something." And she'd smile, a hopeful, tired smile, because she could sense it too. The man she married was coming back. Weeks turned into months. The man who once doubted his worth had become a student of the new world. I built a network from scratch, connecting with young founders, venture scouts, and tech analysts. At first, most of them didn't take me seriously. They saw an old man trying to fit into a young man's game. But soon, they realized something. I wasn't trying to fit in. I was building something better. Because while they chased trends, I understood patterns. While they gambled on hype, I focused on fundamentals, and that's how it began. I started small in advising a few startups, mentoring some founders who reminded me of Evan before success poisoned him. In exchange, they gave me equity, small percentages that slowly began to grow in value. Then one of those startups hit big. A logistics AI company that streamlined supply chains for e-commerce. Ironic. Really, because that's the same sector I once ran at VentureLink. The success of that deal gave me my first real capital again, and that's when I founded Reynolds Equity Partners.id. Wasn't fancy at first. No skyscraper office, no PR campaigns, no interns fetching coffee, just me, Linda, and a rented co-working desk. But I had something far more valuable: purpose. I poured everything I had into that firm. My experience, my contacts, my late nights. And this time I wasn't working for anyone else's dream. I was building mine. Every day felt like redemption. I could feel the respect coming back, not from others, but from myself. When I signed my first investment contract under my own company name, I actually teared up. It wasn't about money. It was about reclaiming what I'd lost. My identity. The old man everyone thought was finished was reinventing himself, in the irony. The very modern strategies Evan had accused me of not understanding, I now mastered them better than he ever did. But I didn't forget. Not for a second. Because while I was rebuilding, I kept an eye on VentureLink. I watched from a distance as Evan made his flashy moves, expanding too fast, burning investor cash, chasing trends he barely understood. He was getting sloppy, arrogant, reckless. And I knew, one day soon, that arrogance would open a door, and when it did, I'd be standing right there to walk through it. That's when I realized something powerful. Revenge isn't about rage. It's about patience, precision, timing. And as I looked out the window of my small but growing firm, watching the city lights shimmer against the night sky, I whispered to myself, "You were right about one thing, Evan. The future does belong to those who innovate." I paused. smiling faintly, and this old man just learned how to do it better than you ever will. A year had passed since I started Reynolds Equity Partners, a year of long nights, small wins, and quiet satisfaction. What began as a scraped-together project on my kitchen table grew into something real. We funded scrappy startups, stepped into companies that were wobbling on their feet, and quietly stitched value back into places others had written off. I kept my profile low on purpose. No press releases, no celebratory posts. I liked the silence. I liked the slow burn of progress that didn't need an audience. It let me think, plan, and yes, watch. I watched the market. I watched trends. And because I couldn't help it, I watched VentureLink. Then the call from Martha came like a match to dry tinder. I picked up my phone in the middle of a strategy meeting with one of our portfolio founders. The line was marked, Martha, private. Even before she spoke, I could hear the tremor in her whisper. Thomas, she said, low enough that the walls might not have ears. You won't believe this. The company's in trouble. Evans made risky bets. They're burning cash, fast. For a beat, I didn't respond. Part of me wanted to hang up, pretend I hadn't heard, bury myself in work and dignity. But the rest of me, the part that still remembered the look on Evan's face the morning he told me to go, leaned in. Show me, I said, keeping my voice steady. She took a breath. They're on the verge of missing payroll next quarter if they don't get fresh capital. The board's scrambling. They're talking to a few investors, but it's all hush-hush. They don't want the market to panic. The words landed and spread like heat under ice. I didn't react right away. Outwardly, I was the calm old man who'd built the playbook and moved on. Inside, my heart was a drum. The scenarios ran across my mind. Desperate decisions, fire sales, panic rounds where ownership gets diluted and control slips away. The memory of being shown the door burned under each thought. Are they looking for investors? I asked finally. Desperately, Martha said. But they're careful. They want discreet capital, silent partners. They don't want headlines, Thomas. If the market gets wind of this, it'll be worse. There it was. The crack in their armor. A vulnerability Evan had hidden. The kind that opens the door for someone with patience and cash. The difference between a CEO panicking and a CEO negotiating from strength is a small thing. But small things determine fortunes. I sat back in my chair and let the words settle. The thought that rose up in me was not cinematic vengeance. It was practical and cold and very clear. Not out of spite, though there was plenty of that, but because it made sense. If VentureLink needed capital, I could provide some, quietly, from the shadows. This was not the shout of a man raging on a street corner. This was a chess move. I called Mark, my lawyer, before the coffee had time to cool. Mark is a blunt man who speaks in legalese and meals. He knows how deals are dressed up to make the suits feel comfortable. I told him only the facts. Martha's report, the company's condition, the desire for discretion. Mark, I said, I don't want the world to know my name attached to this. Not yet. Set up a vehicle, a private vehicle. We'll make moves through funds, through affiliates. I want to build a position in VentureLink without anyone knowing it's me. There was a pause on the other end. Then the practical reply, we can do that. It's routine. You want to avoid disclosure until a certain threshold? Keep in mind there are rules. Reporting thresholds, fiduciary duties. But yes, we can structure it so you aren't the headline. He didn't need to explain the legal mechanics to provoke me. I knew the thin line, the legal obligations and the ethical ones. I didn't want to hide for the sake of deceit. I wanted leverage, and leverage in the corporate world is most often bought one quiet share at a time. I told Mark to proceed. And because I'd learned in my years that patience compounds more reliably than luck, we started small. First came the reconnaissance. I had people call old contacts, quietly ask about cash flows and recent contracts, listen for the telltale signs of a company that's living off runway and wishful thinking. I used my connections at industry conferences to hear offhand how their integration with a certain logistics AI was failing. I watched the public filings, those dry, beige documents that sometimes confess everything if you read them carefully. While outwardly we attended to our existing investments, Reynolds Equity opened a few private doors. Seed checks into businesses that had ties to VentureLink's supply chain, convertible notes into firms that supplied components to their platforms. Nothing flashy. Everything calculated to give us slow exposure to the space without the nosy public, and slowly build capital that could be directed when the right moment struck. But the move that really matters in these kinds of stories isn't the money. It's people. Martha was a key. She was still inside, still carrying the fatigue of late nights and the small disasters that stack up faster than anyone admits. Her whisper had been the spark. Over the next weeks, she fed me details in fragments, an off-book contract here, a rash acquisition there, an executive who'd been pushed aside for someone he didn't trust. I listened, recorded, and folded those fragments into patterns. There was no gloating in any of it. Revenge, as I began to understand, was not a fireworks display. It was engineering. It demanded discipline. It demanded that you remove ego from the equation until the final reveal. You don't storm the castle with fireworks if you can instead open the gate. My investments through intermediaries continued. We kept our public face small and respectable. We funded startups that had real tech and real customers, in part because that's what I believe in, and in part because it built the credibility I'd need to be taken seriously by other institutional players when the time came. Months passed. With each passing quarter, I increased our exposure incrementally, not enough to trigger regulatory disclosure, but enough that, if things went south at VentureLink and they needed cash in a hurry, Reynolds Equity would be in the room. All the while, I kept emotions tightly wrapped. There were nights I went home and watched the city lights with Linda, and felt something like shame prickling at the edges. "Is this spite?" I asked her once late at night. "Or is it justice?" Linda's hand closed over mine. "You built a life," she said simply. "You didn't deserve that door. Whatever you do, do it with intelligence." It was the best answer. Revenge had to be smarter than rage. It had to be purposeful, so I kept to the plan. We increased liquidity in our funds. We bought small stakes in firms that were critical vendors to VentureLink. We made offers to a few insiders quietly, advisory positions in exchange for information. I cultivated relationships with a couple of influential trustees who had sway on boards when crises hit. And when the crisis finally became visible, a leaked memo here. An analyst note there, Reynolds Equity was ready. We had cash, credibility, and most importantly, a seat in the room. The seed of revenge had grown into something far more formidable than a petty desire to watch Evan stumble. It became a strategy to restore order to what had been carelessly built, to protect the loyal and expose the reckless. In my quieter moments, I framed it not as payback, but as correction. I would not destroy a company that served people unless destruction was the only way to stop worse outcomes. I would instead steer it, like a tired captain coming back aboard a ship that the young, overconfident helmsman had nearly run aground. On the day I instructed Mark to convert our holding into a controlled position, the decision felt less like vengeance and more like reclamation. It felt like stepping back into a role I had been forced out of by impatience and arrogance. The responsible steward, I pictured Evan's confident smile the day he'd told me I was too old to keep up. I pictured his blithe dismissal of years of work as if experience were nothing more than dusty decorations. I wanted him to understand the price of that kind of arrogance. But more than that, I wanted to ensure that the people who relied on VentureLink, the employees, the clients, the small businesses whose livelihoods depended on a stable supply chain, would not be tossed aside because of a CEO's ego. That's how the seed of revenge became a plan, not a roar, but a long, carefully tended root system, working from the soil up. It was patient. It was cold. It was precise. And as the pieces began to fall into place, I felt the old certainty return. The surety that experience, when wielded correctly, is not something to be discarded but a weapon of its own kind. I had one more move left. And when it came, it wouldn't be blind anger. It would be inevitability. The game finally had begun. The sweet thing about silence is that it hides your sharpest moves. While Evan was out there pretending to be the next Steve Jobs of logistics, giving interviews, posting glossy photos, and bragging about revolutionary AI integrations, I was quietly tightening a financial noose around his empire. Every week, my firm, Reynolds Equity Partners, made small but strategic acquisitions. Not directly, of course. I wasn't stupid. I set up shell companies, quiet, faceless entities that blended into the corporate ecosystem like whispers in a crowded room. One held 4% here, another 6% there. Individually, they looked harmless. Collectively, they formed an army, all marching under my silent command. By month 6, I had mapped out VentureLink's internal weaknesses. I knew which departments were bleeding money. I knew which vendors weren't being paid on time. And more importantly, I knew which investors were panicking, ready to sell their shares at a loss to cut ties. That's where I moved in. Whenever a nervous shareholder sold their stake, my network bought it. Slowly, meticulously. It was like playing chess blindfolded, guided only by memory and instinct, and I never missed a move. Evan didn't notice. He was too busy trying to impress the media with bold announcements and futuristic slogans, the kind of hollow talk that dazzles investors for a season and then burns out. But behind the scenes, his house of cards was trembling, and I was the wind. Months passed, and the numbers began to shift in my favor. One morning, my attorney, Jonathan, entered my office with a faint smile. He placed a thick folder on my desk and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Reynolds. As of this morning, you officially own 42% of VentureLink's voting stock, through multiple entities. You're the shadow behind the curtain." I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of poetic justice settling in. The same company that had once thrown me out like yesterday's trash now belonged quietly to me, but I wasn't ready to reveal myself, not yet. No, this wasn't just about ownership. It was about timing. Revenge isn't about rage. It's about patience. The art of letting your enemy dig his own grave, while you hand him the shovel with a smile. The cracks in VentureLink's foundation began to widen. Evan's young blood, hires, the same ones he'd claimed would revolutionize the company when we're bleeding it dry. Projects missed deadlines, clients pulled out, and morale plummeted. I watched it all from afar, almost like a scientist observing a failed experiment. Every quarter, I'd review their internal reports, documents I had access to through my investment firms, and each one read like a slow obituary for a company that had lost its soul. They didn't realize it yet, but their collapse was no longer a possibility. It was a countdown. Then came the message from the board. Emergency shareholders meeting scheduled. Topic: financial stability and leadership confidence vote. The stage was set. The day of the meeting felt almost cinematic. I arrived at the downtown conference tower early, the same building I used to walk into as an employee, coffee in hand, dreams in heart. This time I walked in as a man with silent power, no badge, no title, but full control. The boardroom was filled with faces I recognized, people who once looked through me like I was furniture. They whispered among themselves as I took a seat in the back, unnoticed at first. Then Evan entered, tailored suit, confident smirk, the same self-satisfied swagger that had once charmed investors and blinded him to the loyalty he destroyed. He began his speech with fake optimism. "Ladies and gentlemen, VentureLink is simply in a transition phase. With the right new funding, I'm confident we'll not only recover, but..." He stopped mid-sentence when the lead attorney stood up and interrupted him. "Mr. Parker, before we proceed, one of our largest investors has requested to address the board." Evan frowned. Largest investor? Who would that be? And then the doors opened. The room turned as I stepped in. Gray suit, calm face, carrying nothing but a folder and 3 decades of earned authority. The silence was deafening. Evan's face drained of color. "Thomas?" He stammered, disbelief twisting his expression. What are you doing here?" I smiled. A slow, knowing smile. "Hello, Evan. Long time no see." He looked around, searching for answers, but the attorney simply nodded toward me. "Mr. Reynolds represents a significant ownership position in VentureLink. He's entitled to address the board." For a few seconds, he couldn't even speak. Then he tried to laugh it off. "This is absurd. You don't have shares in VentureLink." I placed the folder on the table and slid it toward him. Inside was the documented ownership breakdown, the quiet trail of investments, the shell companies, the merger certificates, the signed proxy agreements. His trembling fingers flipped through the pages. Each line was a nail in the coffin of his arrogance. Finally, he looked up, his voice barely a whisper. You planned this?" I nodded. "You said you wanted young blood, Evan. Turns out, the old blood still knows how to draw strength." The room stayed silent as I continued. "You taught me something valuable the day you fired me," I said. voice steady. You taught me that loyalty means nothing to those who worship trends. But you forgot one thing, and experience doesn't age. It compounds. The board listened in silence. Even those who once followed Evan without question seemed to shift in their seats, realizing where the tide had turned. Evan tried to salvage his dignity, stammering about innovation, risk, and progress, but the words no longer carried weight. The board called for a vote of confidence, a polite corporate execution. When the results were tallied, the decision was unanimous. Evan Parker was removed as CEO. As I left the building that day, I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. Revenge isn't about shouting victory from rooftops, it's about quiet satisfaction. The kind that settles in your bones like peace after a storm. I stood outside looking up at the glass tower that bore no name. It once represented my downfall. Now it was the monument to my return. The student had betrayed the teacher, but the teacher had outlasted the lesson, and the story was far from over. Because now that I owned VentureLink, I would rebuild it, not for him, not for the world, but for every person who's ever been told they were too old to matter. The old dog hadn't just learned new tricks, he had rewritten the entire game. I didn't choose to humiliate Evan the way he'd humiliated me. That would have been petty, a headline-grabbing scene that would satisfy the crowd for a day and feed regret for a lifetime. No, I wanted something deeper. I wanted a correction that would teach him what he'd never bothered to learn. Leadership isn't a title. It's a responsibility. The morning after the shareholders' vote, the boardroom still smelled faintly of coffee and tension. People drifted in, hushed and cautious. I took my usual seat, the one that let me see everyone without being in the spotlight. Evan walked in like a man who'd rehearsed confidence into a mask. He met my eyes for the first time since the reveal, and I could see the calculation begin. Salvage the image, keep the narrative, survive. I spoke first, slow and deliberate. Evan, I'm not here to burn the company down. I'm here to save what matters, the people, the clients, the systems we built together. You can stay as CEO on one condition. Board decisions will go through me. You will answer to the board and to me. His jaw tightened. I watched the muscles in his neck work as he swallowed pride and logic. He was a man used to reading headlines and choosing whatever version of the truth fit the moment. This time, though, the company needed capital, and capital meant control. He had no choice. Fine, he said finally, voice flat, if that's what it takes to keep us afloat. But his acceptance sounded like defeat. He tried to mask it with bravado, with the usual chatter about agility and lean pivots, but the sound didn't reach anyone's ears. The room had a different rhythm now. Decisions moved slower, more carefully. People turned to me not because my name was on a piece of paper, but because I earned it back through action. From that day on, I watched him closely. Not out of malice, but out of duty. He had made reckless bets. Part of my responsibility was to undo the damage before it collapsed the livelihoods of hundreds. He had to learn to be accountable. And so I set the rules of engagement. He could keep his title, his office, his image in interviews. But any strategic move, hires above a certain salary band, acquisition proposals, pivots that altered the company's cash burn trajectory, required board approval, and my vote was decisive. That alone changed his behavior. Confidence that draws funding is different from confidence that draws competence. He had the former. He lacked the latter. I didn't micromanage in public. That would have been humiliating, and humiliation never teaches. Instead, I instituted quiet oversight. Weekly reviews with the executive team, transparent reporting matrices, mandatory risk assessments before any high-value decision. Paperwork, in many ways, is a teacher. It makes people slow down, think, and answer for their choices. At first, Evan tried to push through things. He sent over a flashy acquisition proposal of a trendy last-mile app. Bright branding, flashy projections, a charismatic founder with a story, and nothing much else. He presented it with the same panache that once charmed investors. I asked 3 questions, each simple and surgical. Show me the unit economics. Prove the churn assumptions. Demonstrate the integration plan for our existing platform. He stumbled. The projections, it turned out, relied on optimistic retention numbers and ignored the cost of integrating 2 incompatible tech stacks. When the board saw the gaps, we tabled the deal. Evan's expression that day, a mix of anger and disbelief, said more than words could. He'd been used to yes from people who wanted his photo op. Now he had to face the math. There were other moments more subtle and cruel in their clarity. He would propose a flashy marketing campaign with influencers and viral hooks that promised rapid user growth. I would ask for the funnel metrics: acquisition cost per user, lifetime value, break-even horizon. He couldn't answer. I'd suggest a pilot with measurable KPIs and incremental budgets. He would balk, wanting the splash. I'd remind him gently. Splash doesn't pay payroll. The board backed the conservative pilot. The pilot found real traction, and we scaled that instead of betting the company on a viral hope. Watching him squirm was not the point. The point was the lesson it forced upon him. Leadership that confuses sound judgment with bravado costs people their jobs. He had once told me experience was obsolete. Now we had to watch experience correct his mistakes in real time. Employees noticed the change, but not in the way you might expect. They had feared a vindictive takeover, the story of the fired mentor returning to stomp a protege flat. Instead, what they saw was a slow, careful house cleaning. Departments began to get the support they needed. Vendors paid on time. The engineering team, which had been under-resourced and demoralized, got the bandwidth to finish a stability upgrade. I would speak to line managers in their own offices, listen to problems, remove bottlenecks. That kind of hands-on, respectful leadership reminded people why they stayed in the first place. The humility I demanded from Evan had ripple effects. He was forced to sit in rooms with the heads of departments and hear plainly what the problems were. Not scripted PowerPoints, but real operational pain. He learned to listen, sometimes to disagree, but more often to adapt. Each time he accepted a correction without defensiveness, the team's trust grew a little. Each time he pushed without data, we reshuffled the deck to limit downside. One of the most telling moments came during a client crisis. A key logistics partner experienced a system outage that threatened a major retailer's holiday rollout. Panic spread, fingers pointed, and the CEO, Evan, was, in theory, the public face. He wanted to respond with assurances and bold deadlines. I insisted on a different approach. Immediate transparency with the client, a triage plan, and a clear timeline for mitigation. We dispatched our best engineers, partnered with the vendor directly, and provided daily updates. The client stayed. The retailer's trust in VentureLink actually strengthened because we handled the mess honestly and effectively. In that moment, the entire executive team, including Evan, saw the difference between optics and outcomes. There were personal conversations, too. One evening, when the office had emptied and the night janitor hummed down the hall, Evan walked into my office. He didn't ask for permission. He sat at the chair across from my desk, hands folded like a man trying to remember how to be humble. "Thomas," he said softly, the surety gone from his voice. "How do you do it? How do you stay so steady?" I could have answered with a sermon. Instead, I told him a small truth. You prepare. You listen. You accept when you're wrong. You don't confuse momentum with meaning. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I thought I had to be the loudest voice in the room to keep everyone moving." "That's what ego tells you," I replied. "Leadership is quieter than that. It's responsible. Loud voices get attention. Quiet competence gets results." He nodded, and for a moment there was human regret in his eyes. I didn't gloat. There was a subtle mercy in letting a man learn the hard way, provided the lessons didn't cost people everything. I wanted Evan to grow, not implode. Yet growth came with friction. He would make public statements that needed correction, and I would ask him in private to retract or clarify. He resented it. He tried to rally the PR team to spin narratives that painted him as a visionary. I insisted on honesty. Slow, inevitable friction eroded his performative swagger. Board meetings turned into real deliberations instead of photo ops. We reinstated a cadence of data-driven decision-making, 3-year scenario plans, stress tests, and auditable assumptions. I introduced a mandate that all major hires above a certain level have peer review and operational case studies. It slowed decisions down, but it saved money and focus. Each time the new process tripped one of Evan's impulsive plans, he pushed back. Each time he pushed back without evidence, the board reminded him of his fiduciary responsibility. The reminders were polite but firm. They stung. There were moments when old instincts tugged at me, when I could have humiliated him publicly, or fired him outright and closed the chapter loudly. I chose the slower path. That restraint paid off. As months passed, Evan learned to speak less and listen more. He began to ask the right questions. He took responsibility in front of his teams. He stood in meetings and occasionally admitted a miscalculation. Those admissions, small as they were, rebuilt a scaffold of credibility that arrogance had torn down. My revenge, if you could call it that, wasn't a spectacle. It was an education, for him and for everyone around him. It was the satisfaction of putting the company back on track, so that the people who depended on it didn't lose their livelihoods because a CEO chased headlines. It was the quiet power of experience teaching humility and the practical comfort of seeing systems restored. One afternoon, as winter crept in, Evan stopped by my office. He didn't have a prepared speech. He simply looked at me and said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about listening. I want to do better." He did not say it as a plea for forgiveness. He said it like a man admitting a painful truth. It was small. It was human. It wasn't a victory lap, but it was progress. I told him then, actions mean more than words. Show it to the people who make this company run. He did, slowly, awkwardly, imperfectly, but he did it. The team began to respond. The company stabilized. Revenue stopped bleeding. Our investors stopped panicking and started asking about growth again. And through it all, I never lost sight of the lesson I wanted to teach. Respect doesn't belong to the young or the old by default. It's earned. Some people learn that through mentorship. Others learn it through the hard lessons of consequence. Evan learned it the hard way. He learned that character, not age, defines a leader. When the dust settled, he remained in his position for a time, humbled, begrudgingly respectful, while I kept the seat of oversight. I could see the change in him, less swagger, more substance. It wasn't perfect. Humans rarely change overnight. But the company, and the people who depended on it, were safer for it. That, to me, was the true victory. Not a public execution of a former friend, but the quiet restoration of something that mattered: competence, accountability, and the dignity of thousands who relied on VentureLink to keep their businesses alive. I didn't destroy Evan. I taught him. And that, in the end, was better than any revenge he could have imagined. It had been nearly 2 years since the day I walked back into VentureLink as the silent investor. The company had stabilized under my quiet guidance. But Evan, well, Evan was still Evan. He'd changed enough to look humble in meetings, to nod during feedback, to feign patience. But old habits die hard. Arrogance, when buried, doesn't disappear, it waits. It waits for the smallest crack in restraint to crawl back through. And that crack appeared one cold Tuesday morning. The board was due for its quarterly review, and we were seeing healthy recovery numbers, stable margins, improved client retention, reduced overhead. Everything was finally working. But Evan wasn't satisfied with stability. He wanted a headline, something loud enough to make him look like a visionary again, the comeback CEO. So, without consulting me or the board, he struck a secret merger deal with one of our competitors, a flashy tech firm called Swifthall Systems, a company known for its aggressive expansion and messy financials. On paper, it looked like a strategic merger of equals. In reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The first I heard of it wasn't from him. It was from a journalist. A financial reporter called me that morning and said, "Mr. Reynolds, any comment on VentureLink's merger announcement with Swifthall?" I froze. Merger announcement? I repeated, my voice slow and cold. She replied, "Yes, it's trending everywhere." Parker's quoted saying, "This is the start of a new era." I hung up without another word and opened my laptop. There it was. Bold headline. Evan's smug face splashed across every major business outlet. He looked proud, confident, radiant, the same self-assured smile he'd worn when he fired me. But beneath that smile, I saw something else. Recklessness. I could see it in the numbers he'd given to the press. Exaggerated revenue synergies. Unrealistic growth projections. He hadn't done his homework. He'd gambled the company's stability for one more shot at being the young genius he used to be. Within weeks, the cracks began to show. Swifthall's books were a nightmare. Their AI-driven system turned out to be more marketing spin than functioning product. Investors started to panic. Clients began pulling contracts. Our cash flow nosedived. And soon, the same board that once adored Evan was calling emergency sessions. not to celebrate his leadership, but to save the company from collapse. The meeting that followed was one I'll never forget. It was held in the same boardroom where Evan once told me I was too old to keep up. Now, he looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, eyes hollow, tie loose, voice trembling as he presented yet another recovery plan. He stammered through slides and projections, trying to spin optimism from chaos. But the data didn't lie. VentureLink had lost $18.4 million in 3 months. The merger was an implosion, not a partnership. Finally, one of the board members, a stern woman named Diane, leaned forward and asked, "Evan, did you sign this deal without board approval?" The room went silent. He hesitated, then said, I moved quickly. It was time sensitive. Time sensitive. I repeated slowly, my voice calm but sharp. "Evan, we had protocols. You knew that. You bypassed the entire governance process." He looked at me, defensive. "I was trying to grow the company, Thomas. You'd never understand. You play it safe." I stood up. The room turned their eyes toward me. "Safe?" I said quietly. "Safe built this company. Safe kept hundreds of families employed. Safe made sure your reckless dreams didn't burn it all down." No one said a word. I looked around the table, the same faces that once watched me pack my things, silent when Evan replaced me with younger energy. Now they couldn't even meet my eyes. Finally, Diane cleared her throat. "Thomas," she said softly, "what do you recommend we do?" That's when I knew the moment had arrived, the inevitable turning point that time and truth had been crawling toward. I adjusted my glasses, took a deep breath, and said, "It's time for new leadership." "Let's call the vote." Evan froze. "What?" he whispered. I looked right at him. "You've lost the trust of the board, the employees, and the investors. You gambled everything this company stood for, and now the same system you built, the same structure that gave you power, will take it away." The board voted. 1 by 1, 11 votes, 10 for removal. 1 abstained. It was over. Evan's reign ended with the same quiet finality as mine once had. Only now, justice had symmetry. He sat there in stunned silence, his face pale, eyes darting between the faces that once applauded his ambition. When it was done, he stood slowly, barely able to speak. "You planned this from the start," he said hoarsely, voice cracking. I looked at him for a long moment, then shook my head. "No, Evan," I said softly. "You planned it when you fired me." The room stayed silent. Even the air felt heavy with irony. He picked up his briefcase, the same sleek leather one he once carried so proudly, and walked toward the door. No one stopped him. No one spoke. And as the door closed behind him, I couldn't help but feel a strange calm wash over me, because that was the moment the circle closed. Years of loyalty, betrayal, humility, and quiet revenge, and all converging into poetic justice. He left the same way I once did, shoulders slumped, dignity hanging by a thread. But unlike me, he wouldn't rise again through patience and wisdom, because he'd never learned the lesson that saved me. Power without character is temporary. And as I watched him disappear down that long hallway, I didn't feel triumph, I felt closure. The old man they once dismissed had outlasted them all. Not through noise, but through endurance. Justice, it turns out, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks out the door quietly, wearing the face of the man who thought he'd never fall. It's been 5 years since that day, the day Evan Parker walked out of VentureLink with his head bowed, his empire slipping through his fingers. And me? Well, I'm still here. Not as the angry man who once swore revenge, but as the wiser man who found peace through purpose. I'm still the majority investor at VentureLink, though I don't run it day to day anymore. I leave that to a new generation, leaders who've learned to balance innovation with humility. I watch from a quiet distance, guiding when asked, advising when needed, and letting them make their own mistakes. That's how growth works. The company's thriving again. Ironically, it's stronger now than it ever was. The lessons learned during those turbulent years became its backbone: accountability, patience, integrity. The employees who stayed are loyal not because they fear leadership, but because they respect it. I sometimes walk through the lobby unannounced, and a few of the younger staff recognize me. They'll whisper, "That's Mr. Reynolds," as if I'm some old legend from a business myth. They don't know the details. They only know there was once a man who built the foundation and then came back when things fell apart. And honestly, that's enough for me every so often. People still ask me the same question. Thomas, they say, was it worth it? Getting revenge? I usually smile before I answer. Not the smug kind of smile, but the calm kind that comes from having walked through fire and out the other side. And I tell them the truth. It wasn't revenge, I say softly. It was restoration. Because revenge, the kind that burns with anger, consumes you. It makes you bitter, smaller, and hollow. You start to live for the downfall of another person instead of the rebuilding of yourself. But restoration, that's different. Restoration is about reclaiming dignity. It's about standing up after being pushed down and proving, not through destruction but through success, that you were never the problem. When I looked at Evan's downfall, I didn't see victory. I saw the cost of arrogance. He wasn't destroyed by me. He was destroyed by his own blindness, the belief that experience could be replaced by excitement, that youth meant innovation, and that old meant obsolete. Evan taught me something I never expected to learn. Age isn't the enemy. Arrogance is. See, when you've lived long enough, you realize that people don't really betray you for who you are. They betray you for what they think you're not. Evan thought I wasn't relevant anymore. He thought time had passed me by. But what he never understood is that experience doesn't fade. It compounds. Every failure I'd lived through, every crisis I'd managed, every sleepless night building something from nothing, all of that became my currency. And when the world turned its back on me, that currency saved me. Now I spend my time differently. I mentor young entrepreneurs, the kind who value wisdom, not youth alone. They come to my small private office, not the skyscraper corner suite I once had. No, this one's quieter, warmer, filled with books and old photos. They sit across from me, full of energy and ambition, talking about funding rounds and digital disruption and the next big thing. And when they ask for advice, I tell them stories, real ones, stories about people, not just profits. About how a company isn't a machine. It's a living thing made of human trust. One young founder, maybe 26, once asked me, "Mr. Reynolds, how do you know when you've made it?" I smiled and said, "When your success doesn't come at the cost of someone else's respect." He didn't understand it right away, but he nodded. And that was enough. I'm not trying to build empires anymore. I've done that. I've seen how easily they crumble when ego outweighs ethics. Now I build people, one conversation, one lesson at a time, and sometimes late at night. When the house is quiet and the city hums outside my window, I think about Evan. I don't hate him. In a strange way, I thank him, because his betrayal forced me to evolve. It reminded me that being underestimated isn't a curse. It's a gift. When someone tells you you're too old, too slow, too outdated, and they're really saying, "I don't understand your value yet," and that's fine, because value doesn't need validation, it just needs time. Evan lost everything chasing applause. I found peace by walking away from it, and maybe that's the real moral of my story. You don't need to destroy the people who wronged you. You just need to outlast them with grace. Because revenge driven by hate destroys you, but revenge driven by purpose restores you. And in that restoration, you become untouchable. So when people ask what I'd call what happened between Evan and me, I tell them, it wasn't revenge, it was balance, it was justice written in quiet lines, not headlines, and it was proof that the person who underestimated me was wrong all along. Now, when I close my office at the end of each day, I glance at the small bronze plaque on my desk, the one with my old title, Thomas Reynolds. Head of Operations. It's scratched, faded, and heavy with history, but I keep it there as a reminder that even when life tries to write you off, you can always rewrite your ending, because the truth is, time doesn't make you irrelevant, it makes you irreplaceable. If you have the courage to learn, adapt, and stand back up, that's the legacy I leave behind. Not wealth, not revenge, just proof. Quiet, undeniable proof, and that dignity always outlives arrogance.